Hello, everyone, and thank you to the Reproductive Justice Conference hosted by the Institute for Ethics in Public Life at State University of New York at Plattsburgh. My name is John McMahon. I'm an assistant professor of political science and law and justice here at SUNY Plattsburgh, and I am incredibly excited to help moderate this presentation by Vera of Doulas on Bikes. I'll remind you that you can view all the sessions from every track of the conference in the Zoom event lobby. And also let you know that if you have any questions for Vera during the presentation, please feel free to type them into the Q&A function on Zoom. And if we have time afterwards, Vera will be happy to answer that. And so with those reminders, let me introduce our distinguished speaker. Vera is a birth doula and childbirth educator in Toronto, where she runs a business with her sisters called Doulas on Bikes. Vera is a CAPPA certified doula and has to date attended 100 births in homes, hospitals, and birth centers, teaching hundreds of families and other birth workers on topics related to pregnancy, birth, and infant care, most notably on home birth and infant baby wearing. Vera really does bike around for her doula work and is an enviro-doula and an advocate for out-of-hospital birth options. Vera holds a BA with honors from the University of Toronto and a certificate in teaching adults from George Brown College. Before birth work, she held the position of public relations and communications officer at a nonprofit multicultural community health center, an organization that garnered her love for world cultures and different styles of communication. The website for Doulas on Bikes is doulasonbikes.com. And with that, Vera, thank you so much for joining us. And we are very much looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, John. I forgot how much I wrote in that bio. It's going to slide through a couple of the slides. I want to start by thanking John for the introduction and Gloria for introducing me to this conference and SUNY Plattsburgh for putting this on, because it's been an amazing day. I hope you've been able to catch some of the wonderful speakers. If you caught the previous hour as well, Renee Adair did a great job of outlining what a doula does and does not at all duplicate what I'm talking about, which is great. And although we're from another part of the world, it actually is so very similar. So I cannot go any further without acknowledging the land where I am right now in Toronto, historically known as Takaranto. It's the ancestral traditional land of the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabeg, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and actually to many other First Nations people and Métis people who've been displaced from their traditional lands. And I can't continue without saying that, because I am born here from settler immigrant parents, and we are talking about birth today, and I'm specifically speaking about home birth and midwives, and I couldn't go further without acknowledging the Indigenous ways of life that have been severely altered by colonialism and continue to be by the policies that we still have in practice in our birth centers, in our home births, even with our midwives, with our doctors, certainly in our hospitals, and in our ways that we use these spaces. So I could do a whole talk just on that, but I'm not qualified for that, actually. There's other people today who are speaking on those topics. And I encourage you to visit the National Aboriginal Council of Midwives at indigenousmidwifery.ca to follow their work and to learn more about that, because I think it's very, very important. But what I can talk about is what I know about, which is about doula work, because I am a birth doula primarily. Primarily I do birth work and I do childbirth education, and then I do some postpartum work and all that other stuff that John mentioned. For those who care, I did do some actual for realsies, post-secondary education. It all is for real, let me tell you. A doula, just to be brief about it, is a non-medical support person who goes with somebody throughout their labor and birth, and sometimes a little bit of prenatal work and sometimes a little bit of postpartum, but we're there for the transition to life with baby. We're not nannies, we're not best friends at the birth, we're not somebody's mother, we're not a midwife, we're not medical. I'm going to talk more about what we do. But for me personally, yes, I have all these little bit of background for myself. I am a birth nerd. I do a lot of reading today for today and in general. So a lot of what I'm talking about is going to be focused on two main points that I want you to walk away from, because I really could go off on a million tangents. But what I would love for people to be talking about beyond what I am doing today is, number one, doulas help people have good home birth experiences. if at the end of this hour you take nothing else away from you, you have some tidbits about how we do that. And then, if I do a successful job in giving you some tidbits about how we have good home birth experiences with doulas, then the question is, shouldn't everyone have access to a doula if they want one? And how can we, meaning you, me, and everyone, how can we actually make this happen? Because, we've just had a pandemic for a couple of years. We thought things would be somehow different now. And it is a new landscape, but what is really going on? How are we making access more? We're in the same ocean, but we are not in the same boat. Okay, there are people in yachts and there are people like hanging onto a little bit of driftwood. So how are we going to even that playing field? Because right now it's not so even. I need to give you a little buy-in because you don't know me. So where am I getting my information? A lot of it is anecdotal, okay? It really is about doula work because there's not a whole lot of research out there on what doulas are doing and the impact we're doing. So a lot of it is just my own experiences. It's now been over 100 births that I've attended since I did that bio. It's been a few more. So, I've been to hospitals. We have a birth center here in Toronto that I attend birth at. I've been to home births here where I live. I've been to home birth in Mexico a couple of times. So I've seen a few perspectives. I've got a few ideas about some of the stuff that's happening. And a lot of it is assertions of why I think it's happening, but that's part of the conversation, right? We want to get them listed. I do have some evidence that I did research. Some of them I've listed on the last slide. And I just want to stress again that I'm not a midwife. Here are a couple of places that are local to where I am, where you can see more about midwives. They all have research and things like that on their websites. So continue. That's me jumping off a tower. That's not the research here. I'm not talking just jumping off the seat of my pants, but I do want to give you a little context. Okay, so where I am right now in Toronto, it's a big city. We have a population of 2.8 million people. In the greater Toronto area, if you look at our suburbs, we have over 6 million people. Out of those, we've got 38 million people in Canada in total, if you want that for perspective. And where I live, it's about 4,500 people per square kilometer. So I live in a dense population. If you've ever been to Toronto, you would know just by arriving here that we are a very diverse place. We're home to almost half our population identifies as non-white. So people from other backgrounds, not everybody born other places, but we also have a very high population of people born in other countries who've now made Canada a home. That estimate is low. You see like 200 to 500,000 undocumented community members. I would say that it's probably more. And most of those people live in urban centers, and most of our urban center is actually where I live in Toronto. Some of you, I know I have a lot of friends south of my border who might be wondering what I'm talking about when I mention uninsured people. Last time I was in Texas, I had conversations and I heard words like aliens and illegal immigrants. I won't use words like that, but we're actually talking about the same people. I invite you to maybe think about words like undocumented members of society, because that's really what they are. And I can't talk about birth and discrepancies in how we access tools for birth if I don't mention that actually there's a lot of people who don't show up in the census. They don't show up in our statistics. They're kind of living under the radar, but they're still giving birth. And you would think that they're giving birth at home, but actually I don't even know where they're giving birth. A lot of them are not giving birth at home, even though you'd think that would be the option. I'm going to get into that in some later slides. For another little piece of context, where I live, we are our healthcare is covered by Ontario Health Insurance Program, so I'm going to call that OHIP. We have our healthcare covered for those people who are citizens, which means most of your prenatal care when you're pregnant, whether you choose a midwife or an obstetrician, it's covered by government healthcare. Ultrasound visits, your birth venue, even your care afterwards, your gynecological visits, those things are covered by OHIP. And then even like private rooms in a hospital afterwards, it may not be covered by OHIP if you want a private room, but then we've got things like third-party insurance benefits that sometimes pay for that. I want to make that distinction because non-insured people pay for things like the hospital. So I want to talk just briefly about, still in the realm of the context for setting up what I'm talking about. Most people are birthing in the hospital. Where I live, that's the stat, 97% of births are in hospital. High epidural rates are very common in the hospital. This picture here is taken from somewhere that I attend quite often, downtown Toronto, and their epidural rate is 95% when people come in with obstetrical care. Obstetrical care, by the way, obstetricians are surgeons. We are attending our prenatal care with surgeons, right? It doesn't necessarily align with someone's birth plan when they say they want a low intervention, low medicalized birth, but then they choose a surgeon to attend them from prenatal. And then you get a room like this one. The bed has all the up and downs. You don't see the IV post, but that is, ready to be employed for in the background. That's the little table where the baby gets their first checkups after the baby's born. But this is a birth suite. This is kind of typical for how our labor and delivery rooms look in Toronto. Obstetrical care, also the OBs are on 24-hour shifts, typically on rotation, but most of the labor, if you have an OB for your birth, most of your labor is attended by nurses. They are the ones who come in and if there are comfort measures, they're giving them, but mostly the comfort measures are from a medical model. Some hospitals have family doctors attending, but that's not the norm, really. I see mostly obstetricians. And then midwives do work in hospitals. Registered midwives is what I'm going to be talking about. I'll make that distinction in a bit. But we do have midwives who practice in these rooms. Sometimes it's shared care if there's a reason to be mixing with the medical team. And often it's just the midwives who are birthing with the client in these rooms. So they do have privileges at certain hospitals. The thing to note is that those non-insured people that I was talking about, they pay out of pocket for a hospital birth. And this is in Canadian funds, so you'll have to do the little Google depending on where you are. But a cesarean birth could be anywhere upwards of $4,000. A vaginal birth, you can expect it to be about $2,500, depending on all the things that one might get. Everything does get charged if you're not covered under OHIP. So you may end up having your midwife unpaid for, but the doctor fee would be paid for and the birth and everything. So it could really be a hardship for people. Now, one of my favorite places that people choose is we do have a birth center. The Toronto Birth Center is an Indigenous model of care. We have only 3 in the whole province. They're not very close by. 2 of them are under Indigenous models of care, so including ours in Toronto. There's another one in Ottawa, and there's one on the Six Nations territories. And this one in Toronto that's one of the rooms that you see pictured. They all have a more kind of like a bedroom kind of bed. They all have this beautiful tub. There are things offered at the birth center like TENS machines, nitrous gas. They've got this post that swivels around so someone could be dangling off of a fabric or dangling over the bed. There's lots of options at the birth center. Only midwives have privileges at our birth center, and our midwives work in collectives. So all of the registered midwives from the different collectives have privileges to come here with their clients. They've got a few rooms. They've never been over busy yet. So everybody who wants a space here has gotten a space here. And their stats are wonderful. If you want to know more about that, go to the Toronto Birth Center website. They've been putting their stats all the time. Lots of people give birth in the tub here. During the pandemic too, one of the fun things about the birth center is that they were the least restrictive of people's support people attending. In the very beginning, they said, you know what, no more than 5. Where hospitals went to like, nobody, you're not allowed to have anybody. The birth center's like, okay, well, you know what, 5 people, dwindle it down. And then they did finally, when things got a little bit really bad with COVID, they did go down to 2 support people. That did not include the doula though. The doulas are counted separately and the midwife is counted separately. So as far as like restrictions during pandemic, the least restrictions were imposed in the birth center, even though they did have pretty strict protocols. And again, this is free for non-insured people. If you birth at the birth center, it doesn't cost you any money to be there. And then home birth, oh my goodness, there I am many years ago at a home birth. Otherwise, I'd have a mask on if it was today, nobody panic, okay? At home birth, okay, so midwives attend home birth. And registered midwives, which is what I'm going to distinguish in a minute. They only attend low-risk pregnancies. They have many reasons to transfer to a hospital. You know, they might have that as a recommendation if there's meconium in the amniotic fluid, if they notice heart rate fluctuations. They might have many different reasons where they might suggest a transfer to the hospital. And sometimes that even happens prenatally, where things change in somebody's, you know, physiological, in their medical care, and it might be recommended. I like to use that word recommended. Often our providers are not saying that. They're saying, we will transfer now. We must do this. And actually it's a blessing when they tell you what they're doing, because sometimes I've seen it where they just done stuff and they don't even tell you that you're doing it. So, you know, let's normalize making it a request, even if it's something that you highly, highly, highly recommend, that they take your recommendation. Like, please don't turn it down, but it should still be a choice, in my opinion. And, you know, when I read the research about the safety of home birth, and there is some that's very specific to my area, they're very specific about talking about those safe outcomes are safest when the midwives have a connection to the medical system. And look, I've put a red, sorry for the ding ding, I've put a red flag next to this bullet point, because I don't want to say that only registered midwives are the ones who should be attending home birth. There is a difference between having connection to the medical system to not being turned away when you come there with the client. And there's a difference between being actually aligned there and being part of the medical staff. So yes, it's safe when midwives are not shunned by the hospitals, when they're not you know, shamed for having been at home. It's safest when midwives actually are treated like a professional part of the team, who sometimes have a medical reason to transfer during labor. Because you know what, folks, like when it happens at hospital, when things don't go to plan and they have a medical turn of events, they don't start going, oh, you see, we should have known this from the start. But they do that with home birth. When we transfer for home birth, it becomes this like, oh, you never should have attempted it at home. It's too dangerous. And the statistics show that it is not more dangerous to be at home. Whew, I don't mean to be talking fast, but I really want to get through this. Let me take a pause. Let me take a pause because the next bullet means a lot to me. Many people give birth at home without a midwife and without a doctor. And I just want to pause for that, because that's valid too. And I know there's going to be a lot of opinion out there about vilifying this, like that's not safe and that's never a good idea. I know that because I see the comments on social media, you know, for free birth societies. People are very opinionated about it. But, you know, there are many reasons for people to feel unsafe in the hospital. There are many reasons for people to feel unsafe having a midwife there. And, you know, I hear a lot of this even in today's presentations. People like to use the word natural birth. They talk about natural birth, and that's what midwives do, is natural birth. I'd like to impose this word instead of natural. How about untouched? Because midwives are still touching a lot. Midwives are touching a lot still. And I love it when people choose a midwife, because it's a lot less of touching birth. But I would assert that it is a medicalization of birth when we give a cervical exam in preterm, later in pregnancy, when we do cervical exams, or when a midwife sends to an ultrasound visit later in pregnancy, or, you know, when there's not medical indication for those things. Because often what I've noticed, and again, I'm not medical, but what I've noticed is these are often giving us information for why to induce. And if it's a medically sound reason, no one's against having induction when it's a medically sound reason. But what I would actually assert is that it's sometimes safer to stay pregnant than to have the baby come out in a forceful way that way. And we're not necessarily considering that. And I see it in both obstetrical care and with midwives, where inductions are on the rise and they are being offered a lot more. So when we wonder, like, why are people not choosing home birth? Because honestly, it is the cheapest way to birth. And, you know, in Canada, for people who are covered under OHIP, we don't think about the cost of birth. We're like, whatever, I'm going to the hospital, I want everything, it's fine. But, you know, if you want it to be cost effective on our resources, the cheapest way to give birth, whether you have OHIP or not, is to give birth at home with a midwife. It's the least amount of garbage. Physical garbage, I mean, like, you know, packaged things, syringes, blah, blah. Like, you end up going through a whole bag full of stuff at the hospital. You still get some stuff at a home birth, not nearly as much. Let me not get off track, because you know what? I want to say a little bit more about midwives. I want to acknowledge those traditional midwives or birth keepers. Those are the people who will attend birth outside of the system. Our registered midwives in Ontario are in the system, and I'm really grateful to have them. In Ontario, it was illegal to have midwifery practice until 1991, folks. And I know that was the 1900s. It sounds like a long time ago, but that was our lifetime, okay? I was not a small child in 91. So this is our lifetime. Midwives were forced out of the system entirely. So, you know, let's acknowledge that because of traditional midwives and birth keepers, that's why we still have the practice of midwifery even alive and around, because when there were no registered midwives, these were the folks who were continuing the practice. Because if you think about down your ancestral lines, everybody was born with midwives at some point or with a birth keeper at home. Somewhere down, and probably not that far back in your own lineage, you have someone born to a midwife, because doctors and hospitals are fairly new to the birth world. Okay, but I'm not talking about those folks when I'm talking about birth, because I actually don't get to work with those folks very much. People don't have those as often, right? Typically, a doula is being hired to attend birth in hospital, which you saw is 97% of births. So most of our births are also happening in hospital, and and some of them are happening with midwives, but they're not all home births, right? But when I am with a midwife, it's a registered midwife. So things to note about our midwives here in Ontario is that they're covered by OHIP, but they also have funding to see those non-insured people without a cost to them. And they do have hospital privileges, which means that when they are at a situation where they're laboring with someone, their clients have the choice to go to the hospital as their first choice. They don't have to choose a home birth. And I know that's something that a lot of people don't know. Things they don't know about midwives, even people living here in my city, they don't know that midwives are covered by OHIP, and they don't know that you can have a midwife in the hospital. You could still be in a hospital setting with the midwife, which for a lot of people, that makes a difference, because you have to feel safe where you're birthing, right? Okay, let me get into what I really want to talk about here is doulas and home births. And you know what, doulas do this work wherever they are, but I'm specifically talking about, like, what do we do with home birth? How are we facilitating people staying at home? In a nutshell, doulas are making things more comfortable for people. We're helping people to stay home longer without being afraid of, is this normal? Is this normal? Is this normal? I don't do vaginal checks. I don't do palpating the bellies. I can't tell in those respects if things are normal. And if anybody ever said, I'd like to go to the hospital, then we just go, because instincts are very strong at birth. But for the most part, most of the time, people are saying, I don't know, I'm tired of this. Can we go somewhere else? And they just want the process to go faster. And they think that by leaving their venue to go to another venue, it's going to speed things along. And as a doula, let me tell you, that doesn't work that way. So we do keep people laboring at home longer. So even someone who's chosen a hospital birth with a doctor, it's in their interest to avoid being in the hospital too early. And we help them to stay home. We help with massage, touch, positive affirming words. Let me count all the ways that we support doulas. We support the partners too. You know, I recently heard somebody say that we are experts in non-medical techniques for comfort. And that's true. We are non-medical comfort techniques. So when somebody says, I want a low intervention birth, a doula is the way to go. We help give partner a break. We assist with other family members. Sometimes there's pets at birth. Sometimes there's grandparents who want to do things who are not actually that helpful. So we help with all sorts of different things at a birth. But essentially what we're doing is we're taking things off the plate of the birthing person so that they don't have to be worried about stuff. You know, we need oxytocin flowing. If you have anxiety that's building about something, you're anxious about your family members in the room, you're worried about how the labor is going, all of that stuff is suppressing your oxytocin. So we're there to remind them about their birth plan stuff. Hey, what about those playlists you had? Let's put on some music. You know, maybe they want some aromatherapy happening. Doulas come with a whole lot of different skills. So, you know, maybe a little whiff of an essential oil is all they need. We help to create calm environments. And then if the labor plan does change, we stick with them with the transfer. So even if it did happen that, you know, you have to go to the hospital and things change, we go with them. We go wherever a person is birthing. And, you know, I'm not hired by the midwife. I'm not hired by the hospital. And I know that a lot of people talk about that as like, and I will too, when I talk about the solutions of how to make this accessible for everyone. We talk about being part of the medical team, but I don't love the idea of being part of the medical team, because at the same time, the doula is unique in that we are the client's person. We came there not from the hospital. You know, we don't have to adhere to the same protocols that the midwife has to do. You know, we don't have the same responsibilities and pressures that the midwife does too. So we're in a bit of a different position. You know, that's what I'm getting at here. So like, what's so special about doulas? Like, don't midwives do that? I hear that a lot too. People say all the time, aren't you doing the same work? I mean, fine, except they do more. It makes it seem like, oh, well, they do all of those comfort techniques, plus they do the medical stuff and help birth babies. So, you know, what's the difference between a doula? Well, typically we show up earlier than the midwife. So, you know, if somebody is at home and they're waffling about like, was this a good idea to stay home? The midwife might call and it might be too early. It might legitimately be too early. Typically a doula is going to come early and help that person to calm down, maybe give them some ideas for suggested position changes, maybe suggest a bath, maybe help them get comfortable in bed to have a nap. But I often, in a home birth situation, I'm there earlier than the midwife, and I'm helping to keep them calm and help them to keep their midwife from having to come too early, because when the midwife comes, they have a whole thing that they have to do with, you know, checking, charting, equipment, calling their backup, keeping people involved. They have a whole lot of other responsibilities that we don't have. So when we're there, we can really focus on the person giving birth. You know, we could really hone in on like remembering what were those birth wishes. We have notes. We can even check, oh yeah, it was really important to create an ambiance of dim lighting, and let's get those little candle lights out. You know, we're focused on the experience of the birth. So when things don't go to plan, maybe there is a very serious situation on the horizon. Midwives are trained to foresee those problems because they're the medical staff there at the home birth. So they might have a whole bunch of stuff on their mind, like keeping an eye on that fetal heart rate, keeping an eye on that blood pressure. Let's make sure those medical things are going. The doula is not focused on that stuff. We're still there to be focused on, she's thirsty, let me make sure she drinks some water. She looks upset, let me make sure I'm massaging out those wrinkles. You know, we're there to continue to bring in those experiential parts so that we can keep the room calm. And I don't want the midwife to actually have to be distracted from those things. Like, let them do their job of charting and keeping track of everyone's health and safety. We also bring a range of holistic skills, right? Like if you've ever interviewed for doulas, you could interview 5 and get a whole different range of skills that we bring with us. You know, there's the stuff that a certified doula, you know, we've kind of got our standard basic things, but then we have other things we bring with us: acupressure techniques, hypnobirthing skills, meditation, you know, very specific affirmations that we know. Some doulas do yoga prenatally, so they have those skills. I know naturopathic doctors who are also doulas. I know chiropractors who are also doulas, you know, so there's people with mixed modalities. We don't do midwifery work, so we're kind of free to learn other stuff and bring another set of tools with us. You know, doulas are also the truth tellers. Put that one in your back pocket. We're the truth tellers of birth. I've been in hospital situations where the midwives really do have to become part of the team there as well. They're case consulting with the nurses and the midwives and the residents. I mean, not midwives, the doctors, the team there. They have to toe a certain professional relationship with them in a way that a doula doesn't have to, you know. So when they might want to sort of kind of cushion things about what's happening next, I don't have to do that. One example I can give you is an induction. Doctors and midwives are doing this alike. And okay, look, hashtag not all doctors, hashtag not all midwives. Please don't vilify me for doing an all or nothing statement, because it's certainly not. But I've seen this with both sets of practitioners where there might be an induction on the table for very good reasons, or maybe it's not even medically indicated, doesn't matter. But they'll say it starts with a Foley catheter. It's very non-invasive. We put it in the evening, you go home. That's how it starts. No big deal. Okay, how do you feel? And And then they don't give the reality of the cascade of interventions that follows that Foley catheter, because nobody really, let's be frank, nobody really follows that Bishop's score that we learn about in training that would tell you whether it's a viable, to even have an induction start. Nobody uses that. They just start with that Foley if they're able to get that into the cervix. And then you come back the next day and you start the cascade of Pitocin augmentation and all that other stuff. If somebody calls me, if I'm their doula and they say, okay, so I'm going to start an induction, my midwife says it'll just be a Foley catheter on Friday, I am going to be that truth teller that says, okay, listen, I got to let you know, this is what can happen. Do you want to know more about this intervention and that and that and that? Because that's the truth of it. And I've even seen where midwives are not being quite frank about that whole cascade, because you might just start with the Foley, but at the end of it, the baby needs to come out. So if the Foley is not effective to bring on your contractions, guess what? You're going to get more stuff happening. Anyway, doulas sound great. Okay, I know I've talked us up. We're wonderful. So what's the problem then? Why isn't everyone just having a doula? Well, look, we're not covered by OHIP. I talked about that lovely OHIP that we have that's paying for our midwives and our birth venues, but a doula is an out-of-pocket expense. And I would actually I heard the last talk on doulas, and I asked about how much a doula costs. And I know that in other areas, $1,000 is astronomical. Like, what, doulas don't get paid that where we live. I'm in a very big urban center. Doulas are in demand. No one's charging less than $1,000. And even $1,600 is not the top range. It's not by any means the top range. This is more like you can get a decent doula in this range. You might be able to get a student doula for less. You might be able to find a luxury birth attendant for more. But this is prohibitive for a lot of people, and it's not covered by OHIP, like I said, and some insurance companies cover it. So if you have extended benefits with a third-party billing company, if your employer pays for it, some have expense lines that will pay for doulas, but I've yet to see one that pays for all of it. Not in Canada anyway. It's getting a little more known, but for the most part, that's the cost that you're just paying out of pocket for yourself. One of the other challenges is some areas have very few options for doulas or none at all. Not so much in Toronto again, but when you go further out, it is the kind of thing that when you're in labor, you want someone to be able to show up within a couple of hours. You can't have them be too far away, especially in the middle of the night. So that's definitely a concern. Not all doulas are alike. Some of us really are not in it for any experience too. Not everybody does home birth. Some doulas are very focused experts on high risk birth in hospitals. Some doulas do only focus on home birth. Some doulas, I would assert, shouldn't even call themselves doulas. I like the term luxury birth attendant because, that's just more appropriate. Everybody has their own way of working. Some doulas will not attend until you're in active labor. They won't come until your midwife has come and confirmed that. Some people put a cap on the amount of time they'll be with the person before they charge more money or before they tap out with their backup. So not all doulas are alike, and that does cause a problem because, some people are out of scope. Some people do practices that get them into trouble, give us all sort of a bit of a name. But that's definitely one of our challenges. Many people do not know about doulas. Oh my goodness, this is one of the big challenges. And then of those that do know about doulas, half of them think that we're the same as midwives. So that's definitely a problem for why are we not seeing as many doulas out there? Why isn't a doula care for everybody? But a lot of people don't know about doulas, even though we've had some famous entertainers now who have used doulas and made it public. We've had royalty in England use doulas. You'd think that we've become a little more well-known, and we're getting there. We're getting there. And the other thing is, doulas have a high turnover rate. Believe it or not, not everybody can be woken up in the middle of the night, not work with, collectives necessarily, because most of us are independent contractors. Not a lot of people can make this work for the long run. Like, how many births can you do in 1 month and still make it to them? So there are challenges, right? I was asked a lot this, like, has home birth increased because of the pandemic? Everybody thought there were two myths that I think were really disproven. One was, oh, we're going to see a whole lot of babies now because of the pandemic. Everybody's home and, doing what rabbits do. that's not true. Most people are family planning and they don't want to birth in the pandemic, for one thing. And the other myth that I kept hearing is like, oh, well, we're going to see a whole lot more home birth because now that there's a pandemic, nobody wants to be in the hospital if they don't have to be. I got a little bit excited. And has it increased? Well, honestly, I mean, a little bit. We'll talk about the statistics. It did a little bit, but not as much as you might think. And why? Well, we don't have enough midwives. So the registered midwives that we have, especially at the start of the pandemic, it's not like we just suddenly graduated 25 new midwives all at once to satisfy more people wanting home birth. There's already waiting lists for people who would like to attend home birth. And I often get interviewed by people who are telling me the reason they're even exploring having a doula is because originally they were hoping for a midwife, they didn't end up getting one, and so they want to use a doula as a way to bridge having that kind of midwife feel without a midwife. Or a lot of times people are concerned that, okay, well, I've heard so much about, being in a hospital, but I'm still concerned about a home birth. So again, they want a doula to bridge that gap, to be there, to help them to stay home longer and to be at home, because sometimes they're not even wondering if it's going to be enough care to have the midwife. But really it starts with more midwives. And especially in the height of the pandemic and still now, there's more reason, not less, for midwives to want to be in the hospital. One of those was the protective equipment issue. In the beginning of the pandemic, there were midwives going on social media and asking for people to volunteer sewing smocks and masks because there was not enough PPE to go around to people who go to home births and hospitals and attend babies being born, and newborn babies for 6 weeks postpartum were not being given PPE. Like, why would they want to go to more home births? They were actually trying to go to less so they could limit their own exposure to different households and environments. And so even now, like if you go to a hospital, the hospital is very equipped. They've got the plastic shields, they've got the masks, the gowns, all of it, the works, right? So there's actually perhaps some incentives for them to want to be in the hospital. I'm not saying that that's a driving force for midwives to talk anybody into it one way or the other. But when people say like, oh, wow, of course it's going to increase. No, that's actually not how it happened at all. And then, our midwives in Ontario, like I said, it was 1991 when we got our midwives back. It had been like a 100-year gap that we didn't have midwives practicing in this area here. This is kind of a theme across North America, across Turtle Island. It's not just to here, but again, I'm just saying specific to our midwives in Ontario. They're still in a precarious position. They've been fighting for pay equity for years. Trying to be seen as a profession that's on par with what obstetricians do. In a low-risk pregnancy that has a vaginal outcome, the work that they do is quite similar, but the pay difference is astronomical. They've been fighting this in court. Our Supreme Court has agreed with midwives, and our Premier is still fighting them for it. Responded with cutting money to the association. So if anybody follows the politics of midwives in Ontario, you would understand why midwives do not want to take risks with home births. So, are there transfers that happen pretty soon? I mean, I understand why they would. It's very difficult for them to want to advocate for people to stay in places that they don't have as much support, when it might be perhaps a little more supportive to be in the hospital, given that they are in a situation where they're trying to align themselves a little bit more medically so that they can have that leg up. And you know what, quite frankly, let's go back to point number one. Why do we not have enough midwives? Because they're not being paid properly, right? So it kind of goes hand in hand. They're a little bit precarious in their position. We don't want to mess around with the system and have people vilify them, right? Like, what happens when there's one bad outcome at a home birth? Do you know it's like amplified, like there's a million? We do have outcomes at hospitals that are unfortunate. We don't amplify them the same way. And I'm not saying that we should, but let's not amplify one and not the other. All right. Pay equity and ongoing dispute. It's an ongoing settlement. I do hope that they settle soon, but I do feel like maybe there's a little part of what's happening with home birth and why are we not seeing as much homework. Maybe that has a little bit to do with what's been going on for way too long. A little bit specifically more about the pandemic impacts on our births. So Did we see a spike? Yes, apparently in the province where I live was the biggest spike in home birth. We did go up during the pandemic, but out of hospital births, like I said, there's still 97%. And this is just an interesting fact, a little off topic, but nearly 1/4 of people who are in that childbearing age have changed their fertility plans because of the pandemic. So that goes back to that myth number one. Are we seeing more babies because people stayed home more? I mean, anecdotally, I know a lot of breakups actually that happened because that didn't quite go the way we thought, right? Other pandemic impacts on our births, and just a little fly in there, doulas are considered support people. So during the pandemic, there were reduced numbers of support people allowed in hospital. That is still the case now. Currently, we have 2 people generally at most of the hospitals, the one I'm attending, 2 people allowed to support you in labor and delivery birth rooms, 1 person in triage, 1 person in postpartum. They do allow in and out privileges. But during the height of the pandemic, this was not the case. A lot of people birthed at hospitals alone. Even in home births, some midwives were asking for limitations on how many people were present in the birthing room, limiting other family members from being present. Certainly, it is still the case that if a birthing person is positive for COVID during the time of their labor, there are different rules imposed. And in many cases, it means that they're birthing by themselves without their partner there. Masks are mandatory, yes, even during pushing. It's kind of a nurse by nurse basis, a midwife by midwife basis. You really will see a big difference from one person to the next about whether they say keep your mask on or take it off, even in the medical world. I know we've got debates on the street about whether or not masks should be mandatory, but let me tell you, those debates happen in the industry as well. But for the most part, people have been wearing masks during the pandemic and continue to. All right, people need to feel safe where they're birthing. This is what I'm getting to with home birth, right? So why aren't more people feeling safe at home? Like less than 3% of people in Toronto are birthing at home. Why wouldn't more people feel safe at home? The statistics are showing that there is the same mortality rates in hospital as in home birth when we're looking at low risk pregnancies. So why aren't people not doing home birth? These are 2 little cute pictures. The top one, the dead giveaway that this is a hospital birth, is the little tag on the baby's wrist, and the telltale generic birth cap that babies in hospitals get in the little receiving blanket. There at the bottom is a baby born at home, vernix all over him in his own bed. But why are people not birthing at home? Look how cozy they both are. They're both viable options. But, people just don't know about midwifery care. They don't know that it's covered. They don't know about the statistics. They don't realize also that low risk pregnancies, they really do tend to get seen through a high risk view. And this is maybe a cultural thing that's happening, but people seem to think that birth is inherently dangerous and I should be worried about it. And if this is my first baby, especially, I'd better make sure that I'm in a hospital just in case. And I mean, what is the just in case? You have somebody attending you and we have 911 available. These are the things that I sometimes will say to people. Even if you choose a home birth, you can change your mind and go to the hospital when you want to. But I'm noticing that it starts by already seeing every birth as a high risk birth, whether it is or not. So then we see it as like a medical event in the first place. We better be in the hospital, better be with the doctor. But the truth is, if your first baby is in hospital with a doctor, chances are your next ones will be too. This idea that I want to do the first in hospital because the next ones I'll consider at home, not really a thing. I mean, cesarean rates are 30% right now in the hospitals where I live. 30% rate of cesarean just by choosing an obstetrician for your care provider. Those are your odds. If you choose home birth as your place of birth, regardless of if you end up being there, your chance of cesarean is 5%. So just planning a home birth already puts you in a different statistical rate. If you think that you're going to have your first baby in the hospital and then be at a home birth, chances are that hospital is going to make you feel so nervous about birth. It's going to make you think that your low risk pregnancy is actually high risk. In fact, I heard that at one of our presentations today. It was a great line that we make low risk pregnancies into a high risk labor and delivery when we impose things like augmentation and epidurals and rupturing of membranes. We make that into a high risk event. How do I know that? Because then they say that continuous fetal monitoring is necessary. So if you need continuous fetal monitoring, that means you're in a high risk zone. You can't do that at a home birth. And then people go, well, I better not be at the home birth for the second one because I needed all that help for the first one, even though it's kind of the chicken or the egg. Did we touch the birth and already impose these things that now need to be fixed? I don't know. The other thing about home birth, the trauma stories that we hear get amplified. They get told a lot more often than the boring old regular, I was at home and we labored a long time and we danced and we played some music and then I pushed out the baby. Those don't get enough airtime, or I hear people say, oh, I don't want to brag about it because my sister's birth was blah, 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 or my neighbor's uncle's wife had a very hard time. We amplify the scary stories. They get told a lot. It makes everybody feel like that's everybody's birth. And then the ones that don't have enough pomp to them don't get told, and it makes it seem like they're the smaller amount. But really, if we talked more about all of the births and normalized birthing at home, there wouldn't be as much fear around it. Now, I want to acknowledge that not everyone does have a safe home space. It's not like home birth can be for everybody. Sometimes there are medical reasons to not be at home, health conditions that do not make a viable home birth an option for somebody. And there's so many reasons why home is not always safe. Maybe it's not an appropriate place to give birth at home. Not everybody feels safe in hospitals, though. So I can't say one without saying the other, right? Like, let's not vilify people who want to stay home, even if the recommendation is to not stay home. Like, I got it. Sometimes there's protocols that people want to say, yeah, okay, I get it that that's the protocol and I'm still staying home. And I think they should be allowed to do that. Another thing about why do people feel safe or not safe at home is, quite frankly, there's no epidural administered at home. And for a lot of people, they want that option in their back pocket. And birth is challenging. So if somebody's, the nurses don't need to be pushy in the hospital. All you need is somebody to know that it's available. If you knew that someone was coming to your door, you would probably want it at home too sometimes. Okay, let's normalize home birth, right? But there's a lot of challenges. Like, there have been changes since I've been practicing as a doula. There have been changes to the midwifery protocols. It used to be a transfer of care from the midwife to the hospital staff if you wanted an epidural. It used to be a transfer of care if you needed an augmentation with medicine. That's no longer the case. And I'm glad that it's not the case, because I don't think you should lose your primary healthcare practitioner just because you want an epidural, because that's administered by a whole separate person. An anesthesiologist comes in, administers it, and it's gone. But now you need continuous fetal monitoring, and it does put the midwives in a different kind of role than what they used to have before. And it's definitely another way that it is distinguishing our registered midwives from traditional midwives and people who would normally have been doing home births, because that's kind of a new thing. I know that because when I gave birth 18 years ago, it made a really big difference for me personally to know that I would lose my midwife if I wanted an epidural. And it helped me to motivate me to not want an epidural. And I'm not saying that that should be some reason that we, change that back and change the midwifery protocols. I'm not saying that, but it's just another reason why we may not be seeing as much home birth. Because when a midwife transfers now to the hospital for an epidural, when someone says, I've changed my mind, let's go to the hospital, they might be a little more ready to go, okay, no problem, let's go, because they know they're not transferring care anymore. I don't know if that was a motivating factor before, but it made a difference for me. Remote areas of the province are still seriously underserviced. I'm sure this is the case around the world, that, in densely populated areas, you'll have an easier time finding a home birth practitioner. You won't have as well a time in remote areas. And then, criteria for those low risk pregnancies, that restricts a lot of people from giving birth at home. There are some people who are not good candidates because of advanced maternal age. I say hogwash to that a lot of the times, because our bodies are not all equal. My 45-year-old body is not necessarily the same as someone else's. So those things alone in isolation, it has to be a little more criteria, but it really is our midwives with all their protocols is setting up an environment where people have to really advocate for themselves. They have to be very assertive about what they want. And that could be one of the reasons that home birth is having a bit of trouble taking off. And then, trends matter. Please brag about your home births. If you've had a home birth, please brag about it. I hate it when people say, oh, well, She was lucky for having a home birth. Let me tell you, my sister had a home birth. She wasn't lucky. She prepared for it. She took a hypnobirthing class. She had a doula. Her partner was involved. They learned breathing techniques. They knew what was coming up and as much as they could. You know, they weren't lucky. They weren't lucky. 2.6% of people who were birthing at home last year in my city of Toronto were not lucky. They had a birth outcome that they enjoyed, perhaps that they appreciated, but they worked for those. So why can't they brag about it? Why can't they brag about it? People want to tell everyone about their scary story. So how can we make this accessible to everybody, right? Like not everybody will want a doula, but I think it should be their choice to turn them down. If they don't want a doula, they should be able to say, you know what, it's just not for me, but thanks for paying for it, Toronto. Like, how can we make this accessible to people? It needs to be funded. And let me tell you, the idea of charity and the idea of volunteerism is bankrupt. Let's not expect doulas to start working for free or to start making less money. $400 does not cover my on-call time, my childcare that I have to arrange, the 20 hours I may be with you at the birth, the food I need to eat while I'm there. Like, let's not diminish how much it actually costs to be a professional in this industry, but how do we make it accessible to people? You know, this is what I'd like people to keep talking about. And it's not like no one's doing the work. There are lots of organizations. Here are some in my province. If you would like to look them up and give them money, please do. But don't think of it as charity. And the reason I say that is because we're really hung up in Canada about being charitable. That is the old white lady pearl clutching, ugh, we all need to participate. Look, you know what? We don't all come from the same platform of being able to participate in those ways. But if you would like to make some reconciliation kind of efforts, if you want to make a difference in communities, then give some mutual aid. If you are going to be practicing and earning money in the birth world, like the way I do, my business contributes money to places that are not getting jobs as easily as I am. You know, like, why are some people able to get $2,300 for birth and others can't? Sometimes it's because of our privileged place that we hold, okay? So there are places that are doing low-cost services, but they are not free doulas. They need constant funding to survive. What makes a difference for an organization is money. Money talks, okay? We would have more doulas for people at home births if there was money. Like, I gotta say, it's what it comes down to. We have to be able to fund things that matter. So if we know that this is a tool, someone used that quote, if doulas were a drug, it would be unethical not to use it. I just heard that in the previous speech. Really, like, if it's a tool, let's pay for that tool. Right? Like, if we're paying for those other tools because they're important, let's pay for doulas as well. Like, how else are we going to make this accessible to everybody? Because it should not be a luxury service. It should not be something that just the top tier gets. Imagine how backwards that is that we started as like home birth used to have this perception of like, oh, they must be poor, they're at home. And now it's like, oh, you must be privileged and have a lot of money to be able to have a home birth because it requires a $1,500 doula plus a midwife plus a birth bar plus a birth stool plus a pool plus. You know, it shouldn't take all that. It really should be something that everybody is able to have and access. So what I want to leave you today are these conversation pieces. This is the conversation to continue. Yes, doulas help people have good home birth experiences. In every single case, no. But you know what? Across the board, there's research to show this. We're helping people to stay home longer. We're helping provide them with comfort measures that have nothing to do with the medical world. And if that's the case, if we're making home birth a more viable option, then how can we make this accessible to everybody? Like, where are we going to get the money to pay for people? Maybe what we need is like money to fund programs that are going to be training partners and family members to be able to do enough of the care of doula work to be able to do that for people when they can't have a full-fledged professional. I'm not trying to imply that I can be replaced in my 8 years plus of experience and all of the study and work that I do with you know, a sister who takes a crash course. But how can we make it accessible for people to be at home birth? Like, how can they have access to a doula? If there's one thing the pandemic has taught me, it's that we can do a whole lot more virtually than we ever thought was possible. So what can we do virtually to support more care for people, for more people? Here are those sources before you get angry at me like my niece and this fake boob. It's not fake news. I really do have some information. If you want to see more about statistics, it came from Stats Canada. Lots of articles, evidence-based birth. If you don't know it, please find it and read everything she talks about. WAPIO. Oh my gosh, WAPIO, please go check out WAPIO, such good resources. Thank you to midwives. This is my beautiful family in the glow of their after having birthed with midwives. I do really love midwives. I don't want it to sound at the end of all of this like I'm just ratting out the medicalization, because they are my favorite. Please, wherever you are, seek out midwives and doulas and home birth options, and don't be afraid to ask. And thank you. If you're wondering about my shirt, Build Birth Centers, Not Borders, Every Child Matters, Sacred Earth, everything's political. There are no questions, John. I don't know if anybody has a question in the last 1 minute that we have.
No, and if I may then ask a question, can I get your 1 minute further elaboration of the difference you're making between mutual aid and charity, either with regards to reproductive work and health justice and birth justice, or even in a broader sense?
Great. Thank you, John. Thank you so much. I kind of spit out terms that I think are just like ubiquitous, and they're maybe not. Charity is really locked into charitable status. Are you going to get an income tax perk from it? Is this an organization that's been vetted by our government standards, that have gone through the hoops to get this status to be a charity? We have this model in our current let's call it capitalist, in our capitalist models that we have here in Canada and in the US. We need charities to do the work that we're not willing to have for-profit companies pay for. So that's our way of downloading it. Like, oh, well, I know that these things happen, and oh, poor people, I feel bad about it, but let's just give to a charity and that fixes the problem. As opposed to mutual aid, which is, you know what, I recognize that I am a white doula of European background. I am well educated. I speak well. I get lots and lots of doula clients. It's easy for me to get doula clients. My colleagues of color often tell me they don't necessarily do video chats for their interviews because they get hired more if they're over the phone. So that tells me that I'm benefiting from privilege in a way that I cannot ignore. So if I'm earning oodles and oodles more, then rather than think I'm giving charity to an agency that's doing good work, I'm actually giving mutual aid, because part of my money is on the backs of people who don't make that money. So that's my distinction there, charity versus mutual aid. Mutual aid is a community responsibility where everybody wins. Charity is a way for us to keep being for-profit greedy mongers and not caring about everybody else that we step on to get there.
Thank you for that. And thank you, Vera, for your wonderful presentation that I hope lots of folks will get the chance to check out on the recording afterwards. So thank you, Vera, for joining us.
Thank you so much. And I would love for people to connect with me, verakevik@gmail.com. I'm on Instagram, Doulas on Bikes. I am happy to answer questions after the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.